one comes to embrace accessibility by default. We know that all documentation starts somewhere. Whether you're working on internal specifications for your colleagues, writing specifications so that other people can conform to what you're working on, formal best practices, formal standards, or just writing something to say, here's what I want you to do, we all have to start with something. People will tell you, I just want my book to look good. People will say, I want my customers to read in night mode. I want the index terms to pop up so that I can have a peek into what they link to. There are all sorts of things that people will tell you that they want. Often these are called use cases. They're formal requirements. Sometimes people will just tell you, this is what I need. But how do we get from those requirements to specifications? We have to prioritize the requirements and make sure that they fit into the big picture of what we're talking about. We have to define our requirements, we have to test them, and it's a very long process sometimes. And it can often be overwhelming. There are so many requirements that we don't know where to start, and really, there are just so many things, and often time is the biggest restriction. So how do we figure out what the first priority is? Often, like I said, time is the only thing that can really define what we're doing, but time doesn't really help us prioritize things, it's just something that's getting in our way. So many people will tell you when you're working on this sort of thing that all they care about is the way that something looks. But when you're working on large-scale projects and you're not just focusing on one book, the aesthetics of things, which when we're working on books or other web content, we call CSS, isn't really something that we can use as a guiding principle because, let's say we're working on a template that will cover chemistry books, psychiatry books, technology books, hypothetically for my content, of course. The CSS or the aesthetics are going to have to change. So we're going to have to work on something that separates the content and the style, which is one of the guiding principles of accessibility. So right away, we've done something that embraces accessibility. So what about time, which we've already said is a guiding principle that we generally have to stick to? Usually, like I said, we're working under extreme time pressure. So something that you learn very quickly is that we don't start from scratch. There are a number of existing standards, existing specifications, there's sample code, lots of documentation out there, so much so that sometimes you don't know where to start, and that's why at the end of this presentation you'll see some links to some of the ones that are really helpful. And we learned that repeating ourselves just doesn't help. If something exists and it's in use, it's often good. Don't write something that already exists. And if you see something in a proven specification, it's probably a good idea to use it. So I have an example here, something from EPUB 3. In EPUB 3, we have the navigation document, which serves as the table of contents. And this is a personal favorite of mine because I've seen so many people do this badly. And it's just a really simple thing to do, and it works so well. The navigation document can serve two purposes in an EPUB file. It can serve as the navigation widget, the table of contents widget, so that when you tap on that little table of contents button in almost every reading system, it will render a pretty basic, straightforward table of contents. But you can also include a link to that, or just render it as a regular page, and you can design it any way you like so that you can have your beautiful table of contents. So if you have that, then is there any reason to include a standalone table of contents file that just has a list of things that are called table of contents, which isn't terribly accessible? You already have something that's available to assistive technology in your navigation document. Look at that, it's in the spec, it's accessible, it works for everybody. And you've already repeated yourself if you have added that list called table of contents. So using templates, standard structures, saves you time in the long run, and it avoids duplicating work. So we've learned about how to save some time, and now we're going to define our requirements. This is where your dirty work happens. It helps everybody figure out what they really want to do. It defines the scope. It refines the vision. It often helps those people who said, I just want it to look good, figure out what it is that they really want to accomplish. And it helps you get the vision of your projects in place. So I'm going to give another use case from EPUB. You've probably figured out that I do a lot of work in the EPUB world. When working on EPUB, which is an education profile of EPUB 3, we were adding some terms to the EPUB 3 structural semantic vocabulary, which already included several terms defining refining aside and block level elements. There are more than I remember that already existed. Pull quote, pull quote, note, notice, warning, footnote, endnote, rear note, and so on. So we had a number that we wanted to add for education content. In order to figure out which ones were appropriate, we had to take a look at what was already there and whether it duplicated what already existed. So we came up with some questions. If we were adding something called help as a defining term to refine aside, and it was already called marginalia, what would we do if something was both marginalia and help? Would it have both terms, which is allowed, but does it really give us much meaning? So we had to take a closer look, and we had to come up with a resolution. We decided to revisit the whole concept of asides and other block level elements, and we ended up cutting it down to, I think we're down to 4 or 5 terms that can be used. So what we did was we decided to revisit the list of terms, as I mentioned, and make use of the semantic implications of HTML. This is an underlying principle of ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, where you look at the HTML and you try to understand the semantic implications of what is in the HTML already. That makes it more accessible because you're not trying to overload the elements that you already have with more meaning than they need. And you'll see that if you look at it, there are some terms that are in place, even though perhaps we don't need both rear note and footnote because they're kind of the same thing, but we wanted to make sure that everything was backward compatible. So that brings me to my next point. What if there's a conflict? Conflicts happen all the time. Sometimes it's a little bit philosophical, like the one that I was just talking about, but sometimes it comes down to something a little bit more simple. I publish a lot of my books on 2 different reading systems. Reading system A says define it in pixels. Reading system B says percentages are more useful to me. We have to figure out how to do that. I really want to include image descriptions, but it costs so much money. So once again, we're back to that initial very long list of priorities. So again, we have to come back to what the highest priority is. Sometimes it's just a matter of how many books we sell where. This next one's my favorite. I don't really care what you say. I'm going to support the industry standard. I'm a big fan of that one. Often, though, it comes down to compromise, and it comes to trying to solve a very difficult puzzle. And a good rule to follow is try to avoid breaking anything and keeping it simple. Don't break your content structure. It's almost never worth it. You have good navigation, good hierarchy, good list structure, tables, and good nesting. There are many standards and specifications. Use them. They really are very helpful. Often, if you just follow the documentation that exists out there, your specifications will practically write themselves. Don't make your rules difficult to follow. No one will follow them if they can't read them. And really, don't try to accomplish too much at once. Sometimes when we're working on these things, specifications, standards, anything formal or informal, you can tell I spend a lot of time writing these things, you can use accessibility as a tiebreaker. So what do I mean by that? Sometimes when conflicts arise, the priorities are really difficult to negotiate. But accessibility can be used as, I have accessibility in my back pocket, so we'll just use this because it's accessible. And that often works because the documentation already exists. It has the built-in content structure, and you won't get sued if you use something in an accessible way. But also, it's future-proof. And something that there's a large misconception about, people often think that if they make their content accessible, it's going to be ugly. So I put a link in here to a video by Leonie Watson. It's called Design Like You Give a Damn. It's a really fantastic video, and I strongly recommend that you watch it because it will really talk to you about how fantastic accessible content can look. So I'm going to give you a few examples about how accessibility can sometimes act as a tiebreaker. Tables. Tables have a really unhappy history in ebooks, but also on the web in general. Some devices can't display tables with more than 3 or 4 columns. Some devices completely choke when there's more than, let's say, a sentence in a cell. Sometimes straddles and spans don't work at all. Some reading systems documentation just say, don't use tables. But I work in a nonfiction world, and tables are really important. There is some content that cannot be conveyed in any other way. I work on a lot of accounting and finance books, and there's a lot of stuff that is standardized in a tabular way, chemistry books as well. So we really need to include those tables. I will say that in the print world, tables are often used as a crutch, and we're working with authors and editors to remind them that that really isn't such a great idea. If you have an appendix that lists the items mentioned in Chapter 7 and resources for where to buy them, that's a list, not a table, and that should be done as a list because the table will just make for an unpleasant display. So in our ebooks at Wiley, we talked about how best to capture tables in ebooks. If the tables are captured as images, they're inaccessible to everybody. Images of tables are just difficult to read. Cited, non-cited, small screen, large screen, it's kind of useless for everyone. Assistive technology can't access it, I can't read it, you can't read it, it's really just useless. If we capture the tables as HTML, they're accessible to more people. Sighted readers can usually read them. Many reading systems have the possibility of zooming in on HTML tables or scrolling and panning. And those reading systems that don't yet have good support for HTML tables will probably catch up. So we include the tables as HTML. Another example with a less happy ending at this point is math. Displaying math on the open web is tricky. MathML, I'm going to read this, is a robust markup language that provides the foundation for inclusion of mathematical expression in web tables. That means that machines can read MathML, which makes them accessible. But very few browsers can support MathML at this point in time. There are some tools like MathJax that are available that help machines read MathML, but in the ebook world, not everything supports the scripting that MathJax requires. So at this point, most of us who publish books with math are required to embed the math as images. We're hoping for a future that supports MathML so that we can include math in a way that's readable to everybody, because math as images just doesn't look very good, even if you're sighted. Another example is content reuse. Publishers like to reuse the books that they're working on, and this was alluded to in some of the earlier presentations. If I publish a book, I don't necessarily want it to just be a book as is. I want somebody to be able to go into my book and look at Chapter 1 just as Chapter 1 and maybe mash it up with Chapter 7 from another book. If I want to be able to do that in a meaningful way, I need to be able to label every piece of my book. But how can I chunk it in a meaningful way? There are a number of options that people have tried in the past. And right now, the digital publishing, the structural semantic vocabulary that EPUB has works very well in EPUB, and EduPub has added a number of terms. But what about in HTML? I can say that there's a work in progress with the W3C Digital Publishing Interest Group, and we're doing this with accessibility in mind as well, so that this will dovetail with accessibility efforts. And I'm hoping that Marcus and Yvonne will mention some of this in their talk as well, but perhaps not. So you might be wondering, what does accessibility do for me? So what do you do when you encounter a CAPTCHA? I hate CAPTCHAs. I always get them wrong. And after kind of cursing at my computer 3 or 4 times, I use the read aloud functionality. This is an example of a sighted user making use of something that was created for accessibility. You also just want to make sure that your spec works. If you label something as div class equals list instead of using the native HTML, then it's not really readable by a human or a machine, or you can't know for sure, but it is going to be readable if you use the HTML. just remember to test your specs. Just as a concluding point, considering basic accessibility when you're writing your documentation, your formal specifications, your formal standards, at the outset is going to lead to better documentation. Even if you don't go into it thinking that way, you're going to go back to it in the end. It's just going to work better. This won't necessarily solve all of your problems, but it will certainly help you get there. Here's a list of references and resources. I hope that you make use of them. And please feel free to contact me with any questions, and I will send you to some accessibility experts.
Okay, we're going to try to do some questions at the end if we can fit it in.